the panel called Is Donald Trump a Psychopath? I just found out 5 minutes ago that if we called it Is Donald Trump a Psychopath or Is Hillary the True Psychopath, Jon Ronson would have been on the panel, but he felt that the title was showing some kind of liberal bias and wouldn't do it. And he said the reason why he knows that Hillary Clinton is a psychopath is because one time she was in the Rose Garden and the Secret Service man said, "Good evening, Mrs. Clinton," and she said, "Go fuck yourself." Anyway, Jon Ronson wanted me to pass that information to you. But it's fine, we've still got a great panel, and I'm really hoping this is going to be a more kind of nuanced and less Donald Trump is a psychopath panel than you might think it's going to be. I should just explain, so the reason why I'm moderating this panel is because my name's Jon Ronson, and I wrote a book called The Psychopath Test, in which at one point I went on a psychopath spotting course. I'm now certified in that I have a certificate of attendance and very adept psychopath spotting. So I should tell you the statistics. The statistics is that according to Robert Hare, who's like the king of psychopathy studies, 1 in 100 regular people is a psychopath. So how many people are into this? There's probably 500 people into it. 5 of you are psychopaths. Although I think it could be more, because my suspicion is that psychopaths like going to panels about psychopaths. Because one of the items on the checklist is grandiose sense of self-worth. But according to Robert Hare, that figure rises to 4% of CEOs, business leaders, politicians, religious leaders. You are 4 times more likely to have a psychopath at the top of the tree than you are at the bottom, because many of the items on the checklist are rewarded in our system. This is all according to Hare. The lack of remorse, the grandiosity, the superficial charm, these are things that are kind of loved in our system. Plus, if you take empathy out of the equation, what's left is the will to win. So that's why, according to Hare, you're 4 times more likely to have a psychopath at the top of the tree than at the bottom. I want to add that I know from personal experience that becoming a certified psychopath spotter turns you a little bit psychopathic because you start spotting psychopathic traits everywhere. It's known as confirmation bias. And in fact, ever since I heard the phrase confirmation bias, I've been seeing that everywhere too. What I'm hoping we're going to do when I bring on the panel is talk about the Goldwater rule. It's a really important thing to talk about before we start determining whether or not Donald Trump is a psychopath. So let me introduce my fellow panelists. First, the fantastic comedian, Mr. Greg Proops. Creator of the daily show, Miss Winstead. And finally, the psychologist, Dr. Ben Michaelis. Greg.
John.
Hi. Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to ask me something. Before we start, Ben, I think we should talk about the Goldwater rule, assuming that you know the ins and outs of the rule.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes.
So the Goldwater rule was established when Barry Goldwater was campaigning for president, which basically states that professional psychologists, psychiatrists are not allowed to provide formal diagnoses for someone that they have not evaluated in that context. So today, when I talk about Donald Trump, I will not offer any formal diagnoses because that's not clinically appropriate to do so. but we'll be talking about sort of more general psychological terms.
The Goldwater Rule came about because in 1964, I think he just said that he wanted to lob a nuke into the Kremlin men's room. And so a magazine, he's kind of an interesting, I mean, I don't know that much about Barry Goldwater, but he's kind of an interesting parallel to Donald Trump because in some ways he was quite socially liberal. He had some surprising social liberal views, but then he vehemently hated certain groups like communists. And so a magazine called Fact asked 12,000 psychiatrists to give a diagnosis, to diagnose Barry Goldwater from afar. And I think like 10,000 of them told them to go fuck themselves, but like 2,000 did it and said like he was psychotic.
That's right.
And that he had kind of mother issues. It was an incredibly unlikable moment in American psychiatric history. And it demonstrates that we love nothing more than to declare other people insane.
I was just going to say, but it's fascinating that like years back, Bill Frist was allowed to diagnose Terry Schiavo when he was a heart surgeon from a videotape, and literally we had congressional hearings about whether or not Terry Schiavo's family should be able to, unplug her. So like we need a rule for medical diagnoses also. Just saying.
Also,
sidebar, we'll go back.
Right.
how different is Barry Goldwater's point of view than almost anyone who's run for president? I don't see where it delineates him from that much being a psychopath. Considering he wanted to nuke Hanoi and all that. Later, he softened on his social issues, but his family owned a very successful chain of department stores in Arizona, where I was born. And I would say that he was out of the, he was a little righter than they were used to. But two comparisons to Trump would be one, Trump's fixing to get his ass handed to him the way Goldwater did in '64. We shall see what we shall see. But I don't see Trump carrying 250 electoral votes or anything like that. I didn't hear what you said, but it's okay because I don't brook any dissent. And Barry Goldwater came from within the political system, and Donald Trump is an errant, kind of media, self-interested, narcissistic. I think psychopath's strong because psychopath indicates that he has some sort of core beliefs. I would say monomaniacal with narcissistic personality disorder and a penchant for manipulating the media and getting all the attention he can.
I want to ask two questions. Ben, I believe that what Greg just said wasn't factually accurate because I think psychopaths, real high-scoring psychopaths who score like, 29, 30 or above out of 40, don't care about anything but themselves, right? They don't believe in anything bigger than themselves. Is that true?
So essentially, from my point of view and from the clinical point of view, the terms psychopathy and sociopathy they're not really valid, they're not empirically validated terms. So I can't speak about someone in those sorts of terms. When you think about psychological issues, you can break them down into sort of short-term or acute issues. So things like depression and anxiety are acute generally. And then there are personality disorders, which are a lifetime of maladaptive behavior that tends to go against societal norms. And so we're going to be talking about sort of personality disorders, or at least personality traits, rather than sort of acute psychological issues.
Can we take this also into the family members I've had to block on Facebook and whether or not they're psychopaths or
I'm going to have to charge
rigorous pro-craziness that they have been posting.
Yeah. When I first got my certificate of attendance, I wondered what I would do with my new psychopath
Your
spotting
certificate
skills.
of what?
Certificate of attendance in the 3-day course that teaches you how to spot psychopaths.
From Trump University?
I'm sorry?
From Trump University?
You can only minor in it there.
Right. And I wondered what I should do with my new skills. And I thought, no, I wouldn't put them to philanthropic good. I would think about all the people in my past who had crossed me to see which of them I could out as psychopaths. But then actually I did, and I hope at one point we can go into this, I did go and interview a man called Chainsaw Al Dunlap, who, Fast Company magazine did like the 50 worst corporate psychopaths of all time, and he was the only one on the list who was still alive. He had He would go into a failing business and he would like fire people with a joke. Like somebody once said to him, I've just got myself a new car, and he said, you may have a new car, but I'll tell you what, you don't have a job. And even though he often talked about his wise and supportive parents, he didn't turn up to either of their funerals. And so I went to his house, and he got mired in accountancy fraud and was sort of, fucked. And I went to his house, this grand Florida mansion, which was filled with sculptures and paintings of predatory animals. And Robert Hare speaks in the checklist about how they see the world in terms of predators and prey, and it would be foolish not to exploit weaknesses in others. So he was taking me through his garden, and he said, over there you've got lions and tigers, and he was saying this in a less effeminate way. I said it's as if Midas and the Queen of Narnia flew over a particularly fierce zoo and turned everything into stone and then transported everything here. And he said, what? And I said, nothing. I said, it was just a jumble of words. He said, okay. So anyway, but I've got to say, when I do think about Dunlap, I do kind of think a little bit of Donald Trump. And maybe now would be a good time to go through the checklist, given all of our caveats, and we can sort of... Sure. Do you know it off by heart, or should I go and get it from the book?
I have a couple notes just to make sure, but we're talking about the antisocial personality disorder?
Well, no, I'm talking about the hair, PCLR.
Oh, the hair, that would be your...
Oh, I've got it.
Can we just make sure that we have a list of things we can call him by the end of this that are accurate and as awful as they deserve? I really like that. I don't want to be inaccurate, but I also want to make sure that...
I think that you can talk about personality tendencies, I think with a fair amount of clarity. Look, a lot of the information is out there in the world already, and the way someone interacts with the world, these are established characteristics. And there's so much data suggesting that the way we behave in one area informs our thinking and behavior in others. So understanding and talking about sort of what I would say narcissistic personality traits, I think is completely appropriate. The definition of narcissistic personality disorder, just for those of you who don't know, it's someone that is grandiose, that has fantasies of unlimited power, belief in specialness, someone that requires excessive admiration, entitlement, someone that's exploitative of others, has a lack of empathy, and that's a really important one, and believes that others are envious of them, and displays arrogant behaviors. So that's narcissistic personality disorder. You can take that or leave that, but that is the diagnostic. 5 of those, that's the diagnostic criteria.
Out of curiosity, do you think it's important to try and do this to Donald Trump?
Elections are an evaluative process, and being able to understand who we might be voting into office, I think, is really important. And so having this perspective, I think, is valuable for people to say, okay, well, this is who we may be electing. And just so that sort of all of you have this understanding, I think that most politicians have some form of narcissism, as well as people that get up on stage, frankly, to talk in front of large audiences.
Liz, you more than anyone, right?
I have been thinking about myself so much in the last few minutes.
Well, I think that
I really didn't hear his explanation.
I wish you could see the bubbles above our heads.
But that's what I was going to ask, because basically, if you decide to run for president, what you've done is assess the world and say, you know what's wrong? I'm not in charge. And that person's never a good person, right? It's like a weird, it's a thing that you have. Like, we may get on stage because we're narcissists, but I don't want to be in charge of anything. Like, no, ain't nobody got time for that. Like, no.
Just our little world. Now, did you mention that John, at the beginning, I couldn't hear over the speakers, or that he wouldn't do it?
Oh yeah, that he wouldn't do it, yeah.
Because Hillary is a psychopath.
Yeah, Hillary's the psychopath.
Whenever women are ambitious or have an ego or an opinion, they're crazy. And whenever a man like Donald Trump, or and this is going to hurt some people, or Bernie Sanders, and not understand that reality is setting in and exercise their male ego to the ultimate power that nature can withstand it, they are simply being men and doing what men did, which is swing their dick around.
Liz, how many years were you at the Daily Show?
3.
So in those 3 years, you had like a different guest every night coming into that green room, and so you will have met a lot of political leaders in those 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, you meet a lot of political leaders and a lot of narcissists, and you know, it's like the internet has also bred a weird narcissism from people who now get to have their point of view shoved at you, and like Greg said, especially if you're a woman and you have an opinion, and it's kind of like, oh, I see, if I say something you disagree with, I'm a whore. Really? Interesting. Or nobody wants to fuck me. That's what I've never understood. It's like, do you not want to fuck me, or I'm a whore? Because I don't know. Because I'm a super bad whore and no one wants to fuck me. I don't know. I get very confused. So, if you want to tell me after the show, I'm happy on the outside. But yes, there's been a lot of people, but they're also handled. You know, whenever people come on a TV show, they're handled within an inch of their life. And I was also at The Daily Show in its beginnings, right? So I was there through 1999, and then, so what you see is all the shit that can expose people to a lot of stuff. It was pre-Google, it was pre-YouTube, it was pre-anything. And so now I think it takes its different forms. So we saw people who had to really be thoughtful about what they were going to say, because there were so few outlets for them to say it, so it really mattered. And so I think that's a really interesting place that we're in right now, is with people being able to say, you can let the genie out of the bottle, it never goes back in, facts that just get shot out of a cannon are just out there to float around, and it's like, oh my God, people who are not very smart about their research and inquiry can swallow a lot of stuff and make that their truth, and then repurpose that shit in other places that are also lying. So it's like a fact check bonanza of bullshit.
In those 3 years, though, did anybody like come through The Daily Show where you left and everybody just thought kind of, fuck, that was weird?
I would say not really. Not, fuck, that was weird, because if you're gonna work on a show or make a show like The Daily Show, you expect you're gonna encounter that, because you've studied and you've researched and you've looked at that. So I'm not surprised by people's behavior, and it kind of goes back to what I said. You know, if I'm gonna have a politician on, that person thinks a lot of what they can do. They think a lot of themselves and about what they think they can do, so yeah.
I gotta say, like, when I was preparing for this panel, I was thinking I was gonna come out very much against the diagnosing of Donald Trump as a psychopath, because I think it's kind of psychopathic to diagnose people from afar as a psychopath, and this kind of, you know, need that we have to kind of define people by their maddest edges, to kind of, you know, there's a kind of labeling frenzy going on, I think, particularly in America, where like children as young as 2 and 3 are labeled bipolar because they have temper tantrums and are given antipsychotic medication. A little girl called Rebecca Riley died because she was given antipsychotic medication. She was labelled bipolar at 2 and died at 4. So that shows the dangers of you know, sort of frenziedly labelling people. But because I suffer from confirmation bias, I started like going back over my psychopath notes, and there was a couple of times when I kind of thought, Jesus. And can I give you one example? Thinking of Donald Trump. Okay, let me just try and find this. Okay, here we go. It's a story about a guy, when I was on that course, we watched a video of a guy called Case Study H, and he was talking about, you know, growing up and how he locked his mother in a closet, and how he said he never got into schoolyard shenanigans, but one time he broke a kid's arm. He didn't mean it to happen, he just put excessive pressure on the kid's arm and it just snapped, and it was very distasteful, and it was as if he couldn't just place himself there. Anyway, he gets to the moment of his biggest crime, and can I read it out? And as I was reading this, I did think to myself, fuck, this is like a Trump rally. He said, so there was this kid, this boy, and he was pushing this boy to like, because this boy was easily manipulatable. All his troubles were the fault of his parents, and you know, anyway, Case Study H really knew which buttons to push to rile this boy who was already on the edge. And this is what he said. The more he told me about himself, the more leverage I had for manipulation. I just kept fueling the fire. The more fuel I added to the fire, the bigger payoff for me. I was the puppet master pulling the strings. Anyway, eventually the kid became so wound up, he got a baseball bat, jumped into his car with case study H in tow, and they drove to his parents' house. When they arrived, quote, I sort of gave him that mocking look, show me, and he showed me. He went into the master bedroom equipped with a baseball bat, and I sort of shrugged it off. And then the beating started. It was endless. It seemed to last an eternity. He came back into the hall brandishing a baseball bat covered in blood. I came face to face with one of the victims. He didn't look real. He just didn't look real. He was looking right at me. It was just a vacant expression. Anyway, a couple of people in the house died. And of course I was thinking, and I think it's incredibly unfair to do this, but I was thinking of those times when Trump would just rile up the audience and then just step back. Is that a known trait then?
So one of the things that you mentioned, I think, is really important is that tends to go again with this sort of personality constellation is a lack of empathy. And that is one of the hallmarks both of narcissism, but more importantly, antisocial personality disorder, which I actually think is the distinction that is far more important. Again, I don't think it's so concerning for someone that's somewhat narcissistic to run for office. As you indicated, it's sort of part of the job description in some ways. But for antisocial personality disorder, I wanted to sort of read off the diagnostic criteria just so that you can hear what we think of when we think of people that are antisocial in nature, which is someone that tends to get into trouble with the law, someone that is deceitfulness, someone that's deceitful, that's impulsive, that can be irritable or aggressive, that is a reckless disregard for the safety of others, is irresponsible with regard to honoring commitments, and has a lack of remorse for their behavior.
And that's kind of different to the psychopath checklist.
It is.
Even though it's pretty much, they're pretty much interchangeable terms. That's right.
What's the person who has delusions of grandeur about their successes when it's clearly provable that shit didn't happen? You know? I don't know what that diagnosis is, but like when you've got an airline and a meat company and a booze company and a college and a football team and a casino and they've all failed, and then people are like, but he's really successful. I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with that person? I don't know. I honestly don't get it.
Well, you know what? That's kind of out of the psychopath checklist, but it's also out of Norman Vincent Peale's book, and Vincent Peale was his pastor. So you could either see this as like a kind of Norman Vincent Peale trick of just only look at the positive, just to filter out the negative, and that's.
I had an airline.
That's right. So, but should I read out the 20 items on the psychopath checklist? Okay. Item 1 is glibness, superficial charm. Grandiose sense of self-worth, need for stimulation, proneness to boredom, pathological lying, and I remember Hare telling me that means not only that they lie pathologically, but they're not in the slightest bit embarrassed when they're caught lying.
That's another politician thing.
Right.
That's not just a Trump.
Cunning, manipulative. I went through this list, by the way, with Al Dunlap, the corporate CEO who I interviewed. When I got to grandiose sense of self-worth, we both looked up because he was standing underneath a giant oil painting of himself. And he said, well, you've got to believe in you. When we got to cunning, manipulative, he said, that's leadership. Then there's a lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, which is an inability to experience a range of emotions. It's this idea that, and Ben, do chime in at any point on this, it's this idea that there's kind of nothing going on under the surface. It's like they ape emotions rather than have actual emotions of their own.
That's right. And I'm glad that you mentioned the glibness and this, again, the lack of depth. A lot of times when people are sort of in this constellation, they're exceptionally charming. And they're exceptionally good at, in the moment-to-moment, of making you feel special, feel important, because they're looking for sort of that reflected glory in you. That you think so much of them, and they're really good at eliciting these sorts of behaviors. One of the things, for many years I worked for the courts in New York City, the Supreme Court, and would evaluate people for judges, a lot of people that tended to get in trouble with the law. And when you would sit with people that tended to be in this constellation of behaviors, you would often feel kind of good about yourself, like being around them. because they're very skilled at kind of keeping things at a surface level, but also getting you to feel certain ways in the moment when you're with them.
Can I ask one question? Because I'm fascinated by what Trump is. Because we're kind of figuring out maybe parts of the things is, parts of the things isn't. What is the thing about people when they can't differentiate between a giant thing they say and a small thing they say? You know what I mean? It's like, literally Britain happens, and he's talking about his golf course, right? And so, like, I feel like he can't even differentiate what a big problem is and a small problem is. It's all these big, giant, everything seems to have equal value.
I think that's called Twitter.
You know, it has to do with, because again, someone that has these constellations, someone that is narcissistic, tends to think about the world as it relates to them. So it's all about degrees of difference between, for them, what's relevant to them. And so if someone is talking about one's business interest or a golf course, that's really important to him. It has to do with him. And the notion of
6 billion people that will never golf there.
Right, exactly.
Also, he's willing to misrepresent any set of facts and reiterate that, and then, as you say, about being one of the stanchions of being a psychopath is doubling down on your pathological line. For instance, he said, I'm here in Scotland and they're going wild over the Brexit thing. Well, of course, Scotland overwhelmingly voted not to leave Europe. And immediately 10,000 Scottish people tweeted him and went, you're an idiot. That doesn't seem to bother him at all. It only adds fuel to the fire that, see, I said something that I got attention for. His misogyny and his racism have morphed from being misogyny and racism into being an opinion that one holds. And I think that's the blurry, dangerous part of the psychopath argument that we're talking about here. He's decidedly and pointedly racist. It's not an opinion to be racist. Racism exists as a thing, as misogyny does, and he is an avowed proponent of both, and then always couches it in that one. And then you were saying the people who believe in the lies that he tells, obviously that's how they feel, and they want to feel that way, and they want to feel reinforced that their racism is an awesome choice that they've made, and that the world, not only is it a choice that they've made, the world has made them into the misogynist and racist they are by attacking them. So I would add paranoia and delusional behavior to his psychopathy.
So one of the things that we haven't, one of the words that has not come up, which you're leading into, is this notion of authoritarianism, which I think is a really important concept that a lot of you, if you haven't heard the concept before, you're going to be hearing a lot about in the next 4 to 6 months. So authoritarianism is a personality type, essentially. It's not clinically validated fully, but basically people that feel concerned about they're afraid of others taking what they have. There's a lot of hatred for other groups. When they feel threatened, they tend to look to I will say a strong person, although in the book it says strong man, to lead them. And authoritarians are overwhelmingly, it is the single biggest predictor of people who support Donald Trump is authoritarianism. It cuts across all different groups. And so when you have someone that feels threatened, they tend to look to someone to make everything okay and to say that, you know, the world is, you know, defined along these certain lines. And so people that tend to be looking for him have this sort of personality type, this authoritarian personality type.
I want to carry on down the list because I only got to item 7. Item 8, callous lack of empathy. That's like the big one, right? Lack of empathy is what, you know,
it's the through line.
That's the one that kind of, you know, leads to everything else. Parasitic lifestyle. I don't.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The idea that others are there to serve them and that they feed off of others. Again, I don't want to be too biased in this, but if you looking at some of the different claims that have happened over time, such as with Trump University, for example, feeding off of others' belief systems, in Aberdeen, Scotland, this idea that the golf course was going to provide 1,200 new jobs, and yet less than 200 have been created to date. So it's feeding off of others' belief systems.
Mexico will pay for a wall.
Yeah. Okay, poor behavioural control, so just, flying off the handle. Promiscuous sexual behaviour. That one, I've got to say, for me, when I heard that was on the list, that kind of surprised me, because, for me, those times were quite a long time ago, but I look back on it with some fondness. Early behaviour. What? Burgers doing up in the green room. In 5 minutes, there's going to be a Q&A anyway, so in 5 minutes I'll have a chance, I feel like, to talk. Early behaviour problems is one, and that interested me because, just as a kind of armchair called psychologist, because that's when people are too young, like when they're 10, 11 or 12, they're kind of too young to be PRy. They don't know they're going to stand for president one day, so that's when maybe they will display these traits in a sort of unself-conscious way. In preparation for this panel, I phoned up an old school friend of Donald Trump's, and it's kind of disappointing. But I'll tell you what he said. Basically, I said, were there rumours? He was at the military academy with Trump. I got excited when I heard that he'd gone to military academy, because I thought, wow, maybe he was just so difficult and in trouble with the law and so on, that he had to be sent to military academy. And I think there's an element of truth to that. He threw an eraser at his music teacher because he thought his music teacher wasn't good enough for teaching music and so on. He got banned from his... Apparently he got banned from his beach club, his No Blacks, No Jews beach club. He was banned, but nobody knows why. That's kind of interesting. But this school friend of his said, my whole relationship with him at military school was positive. He started off as a kind of older brother, and he simply continued that way. Him offering himself up as an older brother on the beach and then in a military school, that's selfless, unless he thought he could gain something from it, but I don't think he did. Then he said, I think he was ordered to do it by his father, but he was just a nice guy to me. That's what he said. So that's not psychopathic at all, right?
No, certainly not. Certainly not. No, again, these are long-standing traits, and a lot of our behavior, I know we don't really like to talk about this or believe this, but a lot of our behavior is actually handed down. It is genetic, a fair amount of our behavior. And these things emerge very early in people's lives. You see this sort of lack of remorse, or the sort of using other human beings as objects. You see this early on, and it just persists throughout life.
Well, the fact that he had a whole entire show called The Apprentice. Right? Isn't that like the very definition? Like, all of you come before me, and I will tell you if you're good enough to do your job. That's like a fucking show!
I think that you're picking up on something really important, actually.
Of course I am.
We prearranged that. So there's something that there are basically 5 universal psychological values that all human beings have that have been handed down through evolution. They are empathy, equality, loyalty, respect, and purity. And these are the qualities that our species has that sort of have allowed us to dominate the planet, quite frankly. And people on the left tend to value empathy and equality far more, and people that are on the far right tend to prefer purity, loyalty, and respect. And that's a lot of this notion of purity, I think, is a really important part of...
How are you defining purity, just out of curiosity?
Well, it comes from our tribal purity, looking out for people within the tribe. And that's really what Trump is largely appealing to. And if you think about The Apprentice, if you think about his whole career, actually, his whole career has really been about purity and expelling things that are unpure, from the notion of the Miss America contests, expelling people, from The Apprentice to expelling people, to his rallies, to expelling people, to Mexico, like all of these ideas of keeping out. And that's a lot of the psychological appeal that's coming through for people, actually, is this notion of purity.
I wanted to, Greg, sorry.
Just to ever so briefly speak to that point, once upon a time it was very important for the Republicans that their candidates have a modicum of moral sanctity. And that George W. Bush was certainly seen that way, Herbert was, Reagan was, and that Bill Clinton was a failure morally. And that a great deal of the 2000 election was about his moral failure, and that W was going to remove that onus or that smear from the presidency. And now the Republican Party has reached this point where someone who's incapable of fulfilling that role that even Mitt Romney fulfilled up to a certain degree, being a God-fearing family person, Donald Trump fears no God. And his family is a construct to make him look sexy. So they've eschewed what they had pursued for so long and have had to jettison it, and only the old guard seem to be taking that on board and not supporting him. In other words, there will be no one of note to speak at the Republican National Convention. It will be an assortment of reality stars, football players, and people in tinfoil hats and people who live in bands. Because no one who's ever held an honest job as a statesman or diplomat is going to support him. All the presidents have pulled the ripcord on this one. So when you say the purity, it's very interesting because it's purity on his terms, which is the other, the immigrant, the foreigner, the women, whatever it is that he can perceive as a threat to his island of sanctity or whatever.
I think we should open up for questions, but before I do, can I just say a couple of things very quickly? Firstly, the last couple of items on the checklist, lack of realistic long-term goals. I guess we'll find out in November. Impulsivity, irresponsibility, failure to accept responsibility for own actions, many short-term marital relationships, juvenile delinquency, and the last two only really relate to criminal psychopaths who are in prisons. The last two don't really count. So those are the last two. I'd like to open up. I should say it seems incredibly unfair to be talking about Donald Trump from afar, but I should say it's not entirely unusual because unlike a lot of disorders, psychopaths often aren't invited to take part in their own diagnoses because they seem to be cunning and manipulative. One psychopath, or a man who had been labelled a psychopath and was in an asylum for the criminally insane, said to me, it's like it's a fucking nightmare because, like, if I say I feel remorse for my crimes, they say, well, that's typical of the cunning, manipulative psychopath to pretend to feel remorse when he doesn't.
Can I just ask one question? Because, like, when we list all these things about the characteristics, on some level, and I'm maybe just talking about me, I guess like, oh, she's a psychopath, but like when you say some of those things like, not responsible for your actions, like, isn't that kind of like sometimes I feel like Donald Trump is like some dream, like the American dream. He's like this like super arrogant, not particularly attractive dude who's having sex with models, who's rich, who can say whatever he wants, and people love him. It's like, oh my God. So he's like a dream for people who would like to be all of that. What does it say about people?
Yeah. Okay, let's open up for questions. I should say, by the way, if anybody's worried about all the cheering that's in the other room.